Hello, and you're once again welcome to MES on Constructions, where we discuss all things engineering, architecture, and 3D modeling. Today, we'll be trying to model a laundry basket in Blender, and we can easily do that by using the Celtic Link. The Celtic Link is an option that's available in Blender Extra Curve Objects add-on. The Extra Curve Objects add-on can be activated by going to Preferences to activate it as shown. You can simply search for it as shown and activate it if you don't have it already activated. But let's say you don't have it, you can simply go and download the add-on within Blender, install and activate it right away. You can now return to our 3D viewport to start working on the project. In order to use extra curve objects, we need to go to curve, and because extra curve add-on is turned on, we have available these other options. Now we can begin our project by adding a cube mesh, and if you have your default cube, you can simply use it. I had to add a cube mesh since I had deleted the default cube. However, we don't need a top face and can delete that in edit mode. Now what's next is to scale up the top of the cube, and we can select all the top edges as shown. We can now scale with restriction to X and Y axis. Increase the height of the object by moving selected edges along the Z axis. We can move it up by 2000. Now I think we have the geometry of a basket right here, and this is what we need. The next thing for us is to add a subsurface division modifier to the mesh. We can reduce the render and give the subsurf modifier 3 levels as shown. Then in our object mode, we can apply the modifier. We can tap back to our edit mode to work on the mesh. We need a base for the basket, as the shape of the base of this mesh can't work and needs to be changed. Hence, I can simply take these edges, duplicate, and move it down. Let's move it 2500 down. This is going to be the reference for the base of our basket, and we can go on to scale it down to fit the circumference. Now we can toggle number 3, and in wireframe viewport, select every edge or face below the edge that we duplicated and delete them. We can now select the circle and move it to the base of the mesh as shown. And by the way, this project can also be done using a cylindrical mesh instead of a cube mesh, and I think you should try it. However, you may run into some challenges unpeculiar to using a cube mesh, but it's part of the learning curve, I guess. Now let's give this 900. We can extrude this by 300 for now. We may still need to move it up a bit later on. Now I want a circle to be somewhere in between both meshes. Hence, I need to duplicate these edges and move them up by, let's say, another 300. And then we can extrude this down by 300 as shown. What I need to do now is to bridge the edges of the mesh above and below to form the base of the basket. But first, with all pieces selected, I would like to move this mesh along the Z-axis by 300 to bridge the gap between both meshes. It seems 300 was too much and caused the edges to overlap, so we can subtract 150 as shown. We can now go on to bridge edge loops. Note that in order to bridge edge loops, edges must be of a single object and number of edges in both meshes must be the same. Now, ensure to merge edge loops as shown. We can create a base plate for the basket from this mesh by selecting all edges as shown. Then we can go on to duplicate the edges and move them up along the Z-axis by 50. We can select both the base mesh and the circle as shown and make them separate objects from the basket. Let's rename the top mesh body and the base mesh base. This will also allow us to freely work on them in edit mode. Now, we can select the base and move it along the Z-axis by 150. I simply want it to touch the body without necessarily being merged with it. Now we can select the edges of the base plate as shown and press F to give it a face. The face makes the basket look more solid. However, I'm not comfortable with the stiffness of the basket's body. Hence, I can select the edges of the body as shown and move them along the z-axis by, let's say, 150. Then we can move the base along the z-axis by 150 as well to bridge the gap. I think this looks better. Now, what's next is to apply a Celtic link to the mesh. With the mesh selected, press Shift A and go to Curve, and in Curve, click the option Knots and select Celtic Links. Celtic links are generated around the object's geometry as shown, and you can adjust the settings on the panel below. I will be resetting these values to default so that we can walk through our values together and observe the results on our object. And as you can see, changes are made to the Celtic link pattern as I returned values to default. Now I want the bevel depth to be 0.02, and I can go on to adjust my strength from default 0 to 30. You can observe how the bevel controls the thickness of the patterns and the strength controls the width. Depending on your preferences for the nature of the pattern, you can either weave up or down, but I'll weave down by say 30 mm. And now you can see that we have a model looking like a laundry basket in our scene. Well, I can also decide to weave up by 10 mm, and I think it looks even better when I wove up. Now, in order to fully visualize the pattern or geometry of our Celtic link, you can go on to hide its body as shown. You can also uncheck the render so that it won't be rendered as part of our model. And this is because the body is no longer required and was only needed as a guide for the generation of Celtic links pattern. Hence, the more subdivisions you have on your parent mesh, the more complex the pattern of your resulting Celtic link. Now, you need to move this up to the base of the Celtic link. And I think we should also scale it up a bit to align with the edges of the curve. Nevertheless, we can first add a solidify modifier to give it some thickness. We can turn up the thickness to 15 mm. I don't want to apply the modifier right away and don't want it to obstruct my workflow, so I'm just going to turn it up as shown. Then I can select the base plate and separate it so that I can work independently on the base. Let's rename base plate base 2. In order to give the surface of the base a little bit of smoothness, we can add a sub modifier. Then we can go into the modifier stack to turn the modifier view back on as shown. The solidify modifier provided us with a depth to avoid the visibility of the base plate, while the sub give us smoothness. I think this is good. Now we need to turn on the visibility of the body in order to proceed, as it is needed to model the top of the basket. We can use the geometry of the body to draw the top and cover of the laundry basket, so we can go on to select all faces as shown. Duplicate selected faces and move along the z-axis by 600. Then we can also separate it to work on it independently. We can rename it body top. We can toggle off the visibility of the body mesh. Now we can select body top and move it down along the z-axis as shown. Then we can adjust the bottom edges of the mesh by selecting edges and move along the z-axis by 275 as shown. Now adjust the mesh by moving it down and scaling it until it perfectly fits on top of the basket. Add a solidify modifier to give it some depth. Turn up the thickness to 15 mm and also add a subdivision surface modifier. We can turn up the level of the subsoft to 2 and move the subsoft to the top of our modifier stack. We can go on to do the same for the base as well. Turn up the subsoft to 2 and move it to first on the modifier stack. Now we need to model the cover, and in order to do that, we can use the geometry of the top mesh. Toggle off the viewport of your solidify modifier to access the edges of the top mesh. Select edges as shown and duplicate edges along the z-axis by 600 mm. Then separate object and rename it. I renamed mine as body top cover. We can now select the new object and tab into edit mode to work on it independently. Now we can select all edges and press F to create a face for the object. We need to go to our fix select mode to insert faces in our face. We can give it a thickness of 750 and set other parameters as shown. For now, we don't need any modifier on the mesh and can simply get rid of both the subsoft and the solidify modifiers. Now, inside this space, we need to further insert faces. We can set thickness to be 250 as shown. We can select these faces and move it along the z-axis as shown. Let's move it up by 150. Then we can select the circle at the middle and move it down along the z-axis by 50 as shown. Now, the next thing is to create a handle for this cover, and we can do that by simply importing a circle. With the circle selected, rotate on the x-axis by 90 degrees. Rotate along the z-axis by 90 degrees and move along the y-axis to isolate the circle from the basket in order to work on it independently. You can also separate the circle from the cover as shown, and we can go on to rename the new object handle. Select all vertices by pressing A and unselect a few top vertices as shown, then delete selected edges. Now we can go back to our cover to create a midpoint where we can make a reference for the center of the handle. And in order to get on with that, I need to duplicate this and move it along the z-axis by 200 as shown. Then we can go on to collapse the duplicate by going to our vertex select option to collapse edges at the center to form a single point. Then we can select face as shown and delete it. I need the single points to be merged with all vertices on the inner circle of the mesh. Therefore, with vertex select option, we can click on the edges and the single points, then merge at last. Now we can select the central vertex and move it down along the z-axis to cave in the center of the cover as shown. We can now snap cursor to the selected vertex at the center of the circle in order to insert the handle relative to the cover. Select and delete overlapping edges as shown. Then adjust the handle to perfectly sit on the cover. We can modify the geometry of the handle to fit the cover by extruding it, and we can also turn it into a curve. For now, let's extrude. We can also extrude faces along normals to give it some depth as shown. Then we can also go on to add a subdivision surface modifier to the handle as shown. You need the cover in order to model a base that looks more photorealistic, and in order to achieve that we can simply duplicate the base of the cover as shown and use it to generate a base for it. We can now extrude by 100, select faces and separate the object as we will be adding a Celtic link to the main cover, and we don't want our Celtic link to be applied to every part of the cover. We can rename the new object body top cover. Now, what's next is to select the cover and apply Celtic link to the mesh. We have the Celtic link up as shown, but we need to edit the properties of the link as the properties by default was for the body. You can also play around with the thickness and other parameters available here to achieve a desired result. Then we can bring down the Celtic link to merge with other parts of our cover as shown. However, we can see that the curve is quite smaller than our cover, and when we toggle up the cover, it's even more obvious. But we don't want that, and what we want is a homogeneous cover, hence we can scale the curve to the size of the cover. Now select the curve and scale in both x and y direction as shown. I can scale by 1.35. To achieve a smoother surface for the base of the cover, you can also apply a sub modifier. You can also add a solidify modifier to give it some depth and photorealism. Now we can select the curve and align it with the base of the cover as shown. We can also adjust the position of the handle to fit onto the cover as shown. this cover doesn't look very good up close, so I think a better approach will be to use a curve and convert it into a mesh. Now, since I already have a mesh, I can use loop cuts to create an edge which will then be converted into a curve as shown. Select all, but unselect the edges that we recently created, then delete selected edges. We can now work on these edges. Align the edges with the Celtic link as shown, converting to a curve, and model a handle for the basket. Adjust curve properties to get desired result as shown. Scale it down to fit into the circle in the Celtic link as shown. You may toggle on the view of the cover to enable a more precise centered adjustment of the handle. We can also use the top cover to model the center of the cover below the handle. And now you can select all faces as shown and delete them. Then in Edge Select mode, we can select all edges as shown and press F to create a face. Select the new face and insert faces that will align with the size of the cover as shown. Select the inner face and duplicate it. Select all faces using A and unselect the inner face, then delete selected faces. Adjust the face to fit into the space below the handle. We can now insert a face in the face in order to form a recess on the base of the handle as shown. Then move it down to create a recess. Toggle to Edge Select mode, select overlapping edges and dissolve overlapping edges as shown. Now we can freely move the base of the handle further up or down without edges overlapping as shown. We can keep this a solidify modifier to add some depth. We can also give this a solidify modifier. Then we can adjust the settings of our solidify modifiers to maintain uniformity across all parts of the basket. What we need to do now is to join objects. However, we need to first ensure that all curves are converted into meshes. We can also add a modifier to the handle to make it to look more appealing. We can add a subsub modifier, go to object mode and apply all modifiers as shown. Now that all modifiers are applied, we can select the Celtic link and also convert to a mesh in order to successfully join objects. Once it's converted into a mesh, we can safely join all parts of the top into a single object and move it around as shown. We can also join the top of the cover to the base as shown. And we can move down the cover along the z-axis to sit on top of the basket as shown. You can select the whole basket and duplicate to make copies. This brings us to the end of our video tutorial on how to model a laundry basket in Blender. We hope that you were able to learn a thing or two. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more videos like this, and remember to turn on your notification bell to be the first to see our latest videos. Thanks for watching and bye for now.